The man didn't even look at her when he said it. Ryder Cole stood in the middle of the ranch yard, arms crossed, jaw working like he was chewing on something sour, and he pointed, not at Eliza, but at her daughter. At 5-year-old Nora, who was holding her mother's hand and looking up at the horses with wide, wondering eyes. "The kid's not staying," he said. "We run cattle, not a nursery." Eliza's grip tightened around Nora's small fingers. She didn't speak. Not yet. Because she'd learned, the hard way, in places far crueler than this, that the first words a woman chose in a room full of men who'd already decided against her were the only words that mattered. Say too much, and they'd call her hysterical. Say nothing, and they'd call her weak. There was no right answer. There was only the answer she could live with. But Nora looked up at her mother's face and felt the hand squeeze, and that was enough to keep her quiet too. If this story already has you leaning forward, wondering what Eliza does next, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. Subscribe right now and hit that bell, because every week we bring you stories about women who were counted out and came back swinging. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Eliza Mercer and the moment that changed everything. The stagecoach had dropped her at the edge of the Blackstone Ranch property just after noon, in the gray, biting cold of a November day that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to snow or just threaten it. She had one suitcase. It was made of brown leather that had been good once, maybe 15 years ago, and one of the brass latches had been replaced with a length of twine she'd knotted herself. Inside it, 2 dresses, a change of clothes for Nora, a cast-iron skillet that had been her mother's, a small bundle of dried herbs she kept more out of habit than hope, and a folded letter that she hadn't read since the day she'd answered it. The letter was an advertisement, ranch outside Colton, Texas. Seeking experienced cook and household manager. Widow preferred. Modest wage, room and board included. Widow preferred. She'd read those 2 words so many times she could see them burned into the inside of her eyelids. Not widow welcome. Not widow accepted. Preferred. As though being the woman who'd buried her husband made her more useful, more contained, more manageable. Less likely to have someone come looking for her. She'd answered the advertisement because she was out of options, not because she had hope. There's a difference, and Eliza Mercer knew it better than most. Nora had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder for the last 40 miles of that stagecoach ride, and Eliza had kept her arm around the child even when it went numb, even when her back ached so badly she could feel it in her teeth. She'd watched the land flatten out and spread wide, the scrub brush thinning, the sky getting enormous in the way that Texas sky does, like it's trying to swallow everything beneath it. She'd told herself, whatever this place is, you can make it work. You've made worse things work. She wasn't sure she believed that, but she said it anyway. When the ranch came into view, the main house, 2 long bunkhouses, a barn with one side wall that had been patched and repatched until it looked like a quilt, her first feeling wasn't hope. It was recognition. She'd seen places like this before, places held together by stubbornness and not enough money, and men who were too proud to admit either. The yard was empty when she stepped out of the coach, just mud and cold air and the distant sound of something metal clanging somewhere she couldn't see. She lifted Nora down first, then pulled out the suitcase, and she stood there for a moment with the wind cutting right through her coat, looking at the front door of the main house. It didn't open. Nobody came. She picked up the suitcase, took Nora's hand, and walked across the yard herself. She had raised her hand to knock when the door swung open from inside, and a tall man stood in the frame. Late 30s, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had been weathered into angles. Dark eyes that moved over her quickly, the way you check livestock at a market. Taking inventory. Finding it short. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. It wasn't a greeting, it was a confirmation, like he was reading her name off a manifest. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. He looked at Nora. Then he looked back at Eliza. Something shifted in his expression, and not toward warmth. The advertisement said experienced cook. Didn't say anything about a child. No, she agreed. It didn't. She didn't apologize. She'd decided weeks ago that she wasn't going to apologize for her daughter's existence to any man alive, and she wasn't about to start now on a cold porch in the middle of nowhere. Caleb Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway, just barely, which wasn't exactly an invitation, but wasn't a refusal either. "Come inside, we'll see." That was when Ryder Cole appeared. He came from the direction of the barn, and he was the kind of man you noticed before you could help it. Big through the chest, moving with the particular arrogance of someone who's been the most capable person in every room he's ever stood in and knows it. He stopped in the middle of the yard when he saw Eliza and Nora on the porch, and something crossed his face that she could only describe as disgust. Not at her. Not exactly. More like disgust at the situation, at the inconvenience of her existence. "That's the new cook?" he called out, loud enough that it wasn't a question. It was a performance. For who was listening, she didn't know. Maybe nobody. Maybe that wasn't the point. Caleb turned. "Ryder, the kid's not staying," Ryder said. He walked closer, and now he pointed at Nora, at a 5-year-old girl in a coat that had been let out twice already, and said it again, louder, like maybe the first time hadn't landed hard enough. "We run cattle, not a nursery. That's not what this ranch needs right now." Nora pressed against Eliza's leg. Eliza felt the pressure of that small body and kept her face still. "Mr. Cole," she said, calm, flat. "My daughter is quiet, well-behaved, and will not interfere with your work. She will stay with me in the kitchen or in our room. You won't notice she's here." "I already notice," he said. "That," Eliza replied, "is your problem, not mine." It was the wrong thing to say if she wanted to make friends. She knew that. She said it anyway. Ryder Cole's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Caleb, and the look that passed between them was the kind that has an entire conversation inside it. The kind where someone is saying, "You brought this here, and this is going to be a problem." Caleb said nothing, which, Eliza would come to understand, was how Caleb Whitaker dealt with most things that made him uncomfortable. He went very quiet and waited for the situation to resolve itself, or to get worse, whichever came first. She followed him inside. The kitchen was at the back of the main house, separated from the front rooms by a narrow hallway, and the first thing Eliza noticed when she stepped into it was the cold. Not just the cold air, the cold of a room that hadn't been used in a while. The stove was there, a big iron one that had seen better decades, but the firebox was dark and dusty. The shelves held canned goods and sacks of flour and salt pork, but they'd been arranged by someone who wasn't a cook, just stacked wherever they'd fit, no order to it. The second thing she noticed was a small ceramic pot on the windowsill. It was empty. Whatever had been in it, herbs maybe, or a plant, was long gone. But someone had kept it there, in the window, in the place where it would catch the morning light. She didn't ask about it, but she remembered it. Caleb stood in the doorway to the kitchen, watching her look around. "Our cook left 6 weeks ago," he said. "There's been nobody since. The men have been managing." "Managing how?" she asked. "Salt pork and canned beans, mostly." She turned around to look at him. "Every day?" "Every day." She looked at the stove, at the firebox, at the shelves. She did a quick count of what was there and what was missing, and she set the suitcase down on the floor and said, "I'll cook supper tonight. If the meal isn't to your satisfaction, I'll leave tomorrow morning and you owe me nothing." Caleb blinked. "I wasn't going to—" "I know you weren't," she said. "I'm saying it anyway. I don't need charity, Mr. Whitaker. I need a fair chance. One supper, then you decide." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, turned around, and left her in the kitchen. Nora had been standing in the corner of the kitchen, watching everything with the grave attention that small children sometimes have, the kind that sees more than anyone expects. When the sound of her father's boots disappeared down the hallway, she came to her mother's side. "Mama," she said, "that man was mean." "He was scared," Eliza said. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Nora thought about that. "Are you scared?" Eliza crouched down to her daughter's eye level, and for just a second she let her face be honest in a way she couldn't afford to be in front of anyone else. Her hands were cold, her back ached. She had exactly 63 cents in the bottom of the suitcase and nowhere to go if tonight went wrong. "A little," she said, "but not enough to stop. Okay?" Nora nodded, very seriously, the way 5-year-olds do when they've decided to be brave too. Eliza stood up, took off her coat, and started building a fire. The firewood was damp. Of course it was. The kindling was in a box near the back door that someone had left open, and half of it had gotten wet from rain that had blown in through the gap. She sorted through it, found the driest pieces, and coaxed the fire to life the old way, slowly, with patience, blowing gently on the small flame until it caught and held, and finally began to put out real heat. It took 40 minutes to get the stove hot enough to cook on. She used the time to take full inventory of the kitchen. What she found was flour, lard, salt, baking powder, dried beans, salt pork, a small amount of cornmeal, a few onions that were soft but not rotten, half a jar of molasses, some dried sage, a cured ham hock that was maybe a week from turning, and a sack of potatoes with more eyes than a man should have to count. She had worked with less. She had in fact fed 23 railroad workers for 3 days on less, in a supply tent outside of Red River Station in the summer of 1878, while half her crew was laid up with fever and the supply wagon was 2 days late. But that was another story, and she wasn't in the habit of telling her history to people who hadn't earned it yet. She made biscuits first because biscuit dough is forgiving if you know what you're doing, and because the smell of biscuits baking is the fastest way to change the temperature of a room. It's not a trick exactly. It's just the truth. People think they're hungry for food, but half the time what they're really hungry for is the smell of something warm being made for them. She'd learned that long before she learned anything else about cooking. While the biscuits baked, she put the ham hock on to simmer with water and sage and one of the onions, cut fine. She soaked the dried beans. She wouldn't have enough time to cook them through tonight, but she put them to soak anyway for tomorrow, because she was already thinking about tomorrow. She was already planning. That was the thing about Eliza Mercer that people misread as confidence when they met her. It wasn't confidence. It was just that her mind was always 10 steps ahead, always doing the math, always calculating what was available and what was possible, and how to close the distance between the two. It looked like calm. It was actually strategy. She was making a thick gravy from the drippings, adding flour slowly, stirring constantly, the way her mother had shown her when she was younger than Nora. When she heard the bunkhouse door open and the sound of boots on the frozen ground outside. The ranch hands were coming in. She heard them before she saw them, low voices, the stamp of mud off boots on the step, the tired sounds of men who'd been working in cold weather all day and hadn't had anything to look forward to but salt pork and regret. Then the voices got quieter, and she knew they'd smelled it. The biscuits, the sage and ham, the gravy she'd built from nothing. She heard Ryder Cole's voice, low, saying something she couldn't catch, and then a laugh. Not a kind one, but a testing one. And then boots on the floorboards of the dining room, chairs scraping back. She carried out the first basket of biscuits herself. 8 men sat around the long table. 7 of them she hadn't met yet. Ryder Cole was at the near end, and his eyes followed her from the door to the table without any warmth in them. Caleb Whitaker sat at the far end, and his face was careful, giving nothing away. She set the basket down in the middle of the table without saying anything. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the youngest one, a boy, really, maybe 17, with a face still fighting through the last of his boyhood, reached out and took a biscuit. He bit into it. His eyes went briefly closed. "Lord," he said, forgetting to be cool about it. Then every hand at the table reached for the basket. She went back for the gravy, then the sliced pork, then the bowl of fried potatoes she'd put together at the last minute from the worst of the potatoes. Because waste was a thing she simply didn't do. The table got quiet, in the particular way that tables get quiet when people stop performing indifference and just eat. She stood in the doorway to the kitchen and watched. She didn't feel triumph, not yet. She felt the kind of cautious relief that comes when something fragile holds. For now, for this moment, but the test isn't over yet. Ryder Cole was the last to take anything. He let the plates and bowls go around him, and then he took a biscuit, and he ate half of it before he put it down. He didn't say it was good. He picked up his fork and went back to eating and didn't say anything at all. That, she would come to understand, was Ryder Cole's version of a compliment. After supper, when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and Caleb was banking the fire in the front room, Eliza washed every dish in the kitchen. The water was cold by then. Her hands were red and rough by the time she was done. Nora had fallen asleep in the corner on a folded blanket, one arm around the old rag doll she carried everywhere. She was drying the last pot when Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. "The room is at the end of the hall," he said. "It's small." "That's fine." "There's a cot for the girl." "Thank you." He stood there for a moment longer than felt comfortable. His eyes moved to the clean kitchen, to the stacked dishes, to the small sleeping shape of Nora in the corner. Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it, didn't try to. Not yet. "The last woman who kept this kitchen," he said, and then he stopped. That pot on the windowsill was hers. Eliza looked at the empty ceramic pot. "I didn't move it," she said. He nodded. "Once." Then he left. She stood alone in the kitchen for a minute after he was gone, listening to the wind pick up outside, feeling the warmth of the stove she'd coaxed back to life after weeks of cold and disuse. She hadn't won anything yet. She knew that. One supper wasn't a home. One meal wasn't safety. One quiet nod from a closed-off man wasn't trust, and she had learned in the years since her husband died that trust was the only currency that actually mattered, and it was always the hardest to earn. But the fire was burning. The kitchen was clean. Her daughter was sleeping safely in the corner of a room that was, for tonight at least, warm. She'd started with less. She'd done more with less. She turned off the lamp on the shelf and stood in the dark for just a moment. And she told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for 3 years. In a dozen different rooms, in a dozen different situations. One day at a time. That's all. Just one day. Then she picked up her daughter, carried her down the hall to the small room with the single cot, and they slept together in it, back to back, sharing the warmth the way people do when they only have each other. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows of the Blackstone Ranch. Inside, something had shifted. Nobody would have been able to say exactly what, or when, or how. But something had. The kitchen held heat it hadn't held in months. The stove that had sat cold and useless had life in it again. And the empty ceramic pot on the windowsill caught the pale light of the rising moon through the glass, patient and waiting. The way things wait when they haven't given up yet. Morning would come early. There would be 16 men to feed by 5 a.m., and 2 of them would be difficult, and 1 of them would be watching her for any reason to call this a mistake. And the work would be harder than last night because last night she'd had the advantage of surprise. Now they knew she could cook. Now they would start deciding whether they could tolerate her. That was always the harder test. She had passed harder tests. She would pass this one too. She didn't know yet what the next weeks would cost her. She didn't know about the coming storm, or the moment she'd be standing alone in that kitchen at 3 in the morning with every muscle in her body screaming at her to stop. She didn't know about the things she would discover about herself in the worst hours of the cattle season, or what it would mean for the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. She just knew it was cold, and it was dark, and her daughter was breathing softly against her back, and tomorrow she would get up and build that fire again. She always built the fire again. That was in the end the most important thing about Eliza Mercer. Not what she cooked, not how strong she was, not how she'd survived things that should have broken her. It was that she never once, in all her years of hard living, forgot how to start a fire from almost nothing. And in a place like the Blackstone Ranch, in a winter like this one was shaping up to be, that turned out to be exactly the only thing that mattered. She was up before the dark even thought about lifting. 4:30 in the morning, and the kitchen was cold again the way it always got overnight. That deep, settled cold that makes your breath visible and your fingers slow. And Eliza had learned in her first week at Blackstone Ranch that you couldn't fight it. You could only get ahead of it. She moved quietly, by memory now, crossing from the narrow cot to the kitchen without lighting the lamp first because the lamp would wake Nora, and Nora needed every minute she could get. The firebox took kindling first, then the larger pieces, stacked the way her father had shown her when she was 9 years old on a farm in Missouri that no longer existed. The fire caught on the second try. She fed it slowly, one piece at a time, the way you feed something fragile that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to live. By the time the stove was hot, the sky outside the single kitchen window had gone from black to the color of a bruise. She had soaked the beans overnight. They went into the pot with water and salt pork and the heel of an onion she'd saved. She started the biscuit dough. She measured the flour by feel at this point, not by eye, which was a thing her hands knew before her brain caught up with it, and she worked the lard in with her fingers the way you had to, cold hands and all, because warmth in the fat ruins the flake, and a bad biscuit at 5 in the morning is a morale problem you don't need. She was cutting the rounds when she heard the bunkhouse door. Then boots on frozen ground, and low voices, and the particular sound of men who resent being awake but are too proud to say so. The ranch hands came in pairs, mostly, stamping mud off at the step, and hanging their coats and taking their seats at the long table with the particular silence of men who had somewhere to be in an hour and weren't interested in conversation. She brought the biscuits out, Coffee already on the table, strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way she'd figured out by the third morning they liked it. Salt pork, fried crisp at the edges. The beans from last night reheated with a little molasses she'd stirred in, because beans for breakfast are tolerable, but beans for breakfast with molasses are something a man will remember. Nobody thanked her. That was fine. She hadn't started cooking for thanks. But the young one, Tommy, she'd learned his name by the second day, Tommy Briggs, 17 years old and from somewhere in East Texas, and the only one of them who'd said good morning to her without being prompted. Tommy looked up from his plate with the unguarded expression of a boy who hadn't yet learned to keep his face still and said, "Mrs. Mercer, these are the best biscuits I've ever eaten, and I mean that seriously." Two of the older hands glanced at each other. Ryder Cole, at the near end of the table, did not look up. "Eat your breakfast, Briggs," he said. "You've got fence line to check before 9. Tommy's face closed down. He dropped his eyes to his plate. Eliza took the empty biscuit basket back to the kitchen and said nothing. Because she had learned already, in less than a week she had already learned, that Ryder Cole ran the tone of that table the way a conductor runs an orchestra, and anything she said in response would just be an instrument he used to make a point. The way to deal with Ryder Cole was not to argue. It was to outlast him. She'd outlasted harder men than Ryder Cole. She wasn't sure yet if he knew that. She was fairly sure he didn't, and she was, in a quiet and private way, looking forward to the moment he figured it out. The trouble with the second week was that the novelty had worn off. The first week, the ranch hands had been surprised. Surprised into a kind of grudging cooperation. They ate what she put in front of them. They brought firewood when she asked for it. They didn't leave mud tracked through the kitchen the way they had before her arrival. But surprise doesn't last. It never does. By the start of the second week, Eliza had become furniture. Present, expected, no longer remarkable. And that was when the real testing started. It started small, the way these things always do. A bucket of water left just outside the kitchen door, positioned exactly where she'd step into it in the dark. She'd caught it in time, barely, and when she brought it inside, she'd considered whether it was deliberate or accidental for about half a second before deciding it didn't matter. Either way, she wasn't going to mention it. Then the flour sack she'd stored in the dry corner of the kitchen ended up on the damp floor by the back door, and a third of it was ruined by the time she found it. She'd mixed what was left with the cornmeal and adjusted the biscuit recipe and didn't say a word to anyone. Then the firewood she'd stacked beside the kitchen ran short 2 days in a row, though the pile near the bunkhouse was fully stocked. None of it was dramatic. None of it rose to the level of a confrontation. It was the kind of slow, grinding friction designed to make a woman feel unwelcome without giving her anything specific to push back against. And she recognized it because she'd seen it before. In railroad camps, in boarding houses, anywhere a woman tried to hold her ground in a space men had decided was theirs. The difference was that Eliza had stopped taking the bait a long time ago. She went to the bunkhouse woodpile herself and brought in what she needed. She adjusted every recipe to what was available. She kept the kitchen locked at night with the small iron bolt she'd found in the bottom drawer of the kitchen dresser and reinstalled herself, because the lock had been removed and nobody had bothered to put it back. She didn't complain to Caleb. She almost did, once. It was a Thursday, the second week, and she'd come into the kitchen to find the pot of bean soup she'd left simmering for supper had been knocked from the stove. Not by accident, she didn't think, because the lid was across the room and the pot itself was tilted at an angle that gravity alone couldn't produce. And she'd stood there in the doorway looking at the mess on the floor, with her jaw tight and her hands clenched at her sides, and she'd felt the anger move through her like a cold wave, sharp and clean. She started to go find Caleb. She got as far as the hallway. Then she stopped, because she knew what would happen. Caleb would ask around. Nobody would know anything. And then she'd be the woman who complained, which was worse than being the woman who struggled, because at least struggle is private. She went back to the kitchen. She cleaned the floor. She started the soup again. She made it better the second time because she added the ham bone she'd been saving and let it go longer. And by supper that night, the men ate 2 full pots of it. And someone, she never found out who, left 3 sticks of good dry firewood just inside the kitchen door without saying anything. It wasn't an apology. It was too anonymous for that. But it was something. She was learning the language of this place. Nora, meanwhile, was conducting her own quiet campaign. Eliza had worried about her daughter, had been worrying if she was honest, since before they'd arrived, the kind of low-level worry that hums behind everything else and never fully goes away. Nora was 5. She was too young to understand that they were on probation here, that this place could still decide not to keep them, that her mother's position was about as stable as a fence post in wet ground. All Nora understood was that there were horses and a dog and a lot of tall men, and her mother was always busy. The dog was named, according to Tommy, who seemed to be the only one who'd bothered to name him, Biscuit. He was a brown and white thing of uncertain heritage, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down, and a general air of having been through some things. He'd been sleeping under the steps of the bunkhouse when Eliza arrived, thin and flea-bitten and ignored so thoroughly he'd stopped expecting anything else. Nora found him on the third morning. Eliza had been in the kitchen and heard nothing unusual, and then she'd looked out the back window and seen her daughter sitting cross-legged in the cold dirt of the yard, the dog's head in her lap, Nora talking to him in the low, serious voice she used when she thought she was having an important conversation. She'd gone out to bring Nora inside and found herself stopping. Because the dog, the one that had flinched at quick movement and slunk away from raised voices since before they arrived, was lying completely still with his head in Nora's lap, his eyes half closed, his tail moving in a slow and steady beat against the ground, trusting her. Just like that. Eliza had watched them for a long moment, and something behind her sternum had done something uncomfortable and inconvenient, and she'd gone back inside and started on the noon meal without saying anything. By the end of the second week, Biscuit slept outside the kitchen door at night. She didn't encourage it, she didn't discourage it either. The man who noticed first was Walter Boone. Walter was 60-something, with white hair cut short and hands that told the story of 40 years of hard work better than his face did. He was quiet, not Ryder Cole's deliberate, tactical quiet, but the quiet of a man who had said most of what he had to say years ago and was now mostly listening. He'd worked at Blackstone Ranch longer than anyone else, long enough that certain things about the way the place functioned were just called the way Walter does it, rather than having any other explanation. He watched Eliza the way an old man watches something he's trying to remember. Not unfriendly, just measuring. She noticed him on a Tuesday morning, standing near the back fence while she hauled water from the pump. Not offering to help, not commenting. Just watching, with that particular stillness that old cowhands have, like they're conserving energy even when they're standing still. "You've worked a camp kitchen before," he said. It wasn't a question. "Railroad camps," she said. "Mostly the Texas and Pacific Line, a few years back." He was quiet for a moment. "Red River Station?" She stopped and looked at him more carefully. "Summer of '78. You were there?" "I was through there, laying track on the north side of the crossing." He paused. "They talked about a cook. Woman who kept the whole camp fed through that fever summer." "People overstate things," she said. "Not about food," he said. "Not when they're hungry." He walked away after that and didn't say anything else, and she stood by the pump with the heavy bucket and watched him go, wondering what he'd make of what he thought he remembered. It was Ryder Cole who crystallized everything into open conflict, because that was what Ryder Cole did when things didn't go the way he'd decided they should go. It happened on a Wednesday, 11 days after her arrival. The afternoon had gone sideways early. One of the younger hands had gotten his hand caught in a piece of fence equipment, and the wound was bad enough to need proper attention, and Eliza had been the one to clean and bind it, because the nearest doctor was 22 miles away and waiting wasn't an option. She'd done it quickly, without fuss, using the clean cloth and the carbolic solution she kept in the kitchen for exactly these situations. And the boy, Eddie Marsh, 18, from somewhere in the hill country, had gone pale and sweating, but hadn't made a sound. She'd given him a cup of strong, sweet coffee after and told him to sit down for an hour before he went back to work. He'd looked at her like she'd handed him something precious. She was back in the kitchen when Ryder came in. He didn't knock. He never knocked. He came through the back door like he owned it, which technically the ranch did, so she supposed he wasn't wrong. But there was a way to come through a door and a way not to, and Ryder Cole had one way only. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and said, "You had no business playing doctor with Marsh." She was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "He needed the wound cleaned. I cleaned it." "He's got hands to do the work I need him for," Ryder said. "You had him sitting on his backside for an hour doing nothing." "He nearly fainted twice while I was working on him. He needed to sit down. What he needed was to get back to the fence line before dark." She turned around then, because this was the kind of conversation that required looking at a person. Ryder was standing with his arms crossed, the way he always stood when he was about to dig in, and she looked at him steadily and said, "If that wound goes bad, you'll lose more than an hour. You'll lose weeks, if not the whole season. I cleaned it and bound it properly, and he'll be fit to work tomorrow. That is not a problem. That is me doing my job. Your job is the kitchen. My job is to keep this household running." That's what the advertisement said. Household manager. Wound care falls inside that. "It falls inside whatever I say it falls inside," he said. "This is my ranch." "It's Mr. Whitaker's ranch," she said. Quiet. Not combative. Just a correction of fact. Something moved in Ryder Cole's eyes. A flash of something she couldn't categorize, gone before she could get a good look at it. He uncrossed his arms and pointed at her the way he had that first day, in the yard, pointing at Nora, and he said, "You watch yourself, Mrs. Mercer. You're here on tolerance. Don't forget that." He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone, listening to the sound of her own breathing, feeling the tension in her shoulders and her hands, and the place behind her eyes where headaches started when she let things get to her. She picked up the wooden spoon and went back to the pot. She'd been warned before, by better men than Ryder Cole. She was still here. What she didn't know, standing in that kitchen with the spoon in her hand and the fire going, was that Ryder Cole had gone directly from the kitchen to the front room, where Caleb Whitaker was going over the season's accounts, and had said in the flat, certain way he said things. "That woman is going to be a problem. You need to make a decision before she makes one for you." She didn't know that Caleb had sat there for a long time after Ryder left, not looking at the accounts, looking at the wall. She didn't know that on the shelf above his desk, in the front room she hadn't been invited into, there was a second ceramic pot, this one with a dried sprig of something still in it, preserved and brittle, that Caleb's first wife had moved from the kitchen windowsill to his desk in the last months of her life because she'd said she wanted to see something growing from wherever she happened to be sitting. She didn't know any of that yet. What she did know was that Thursday morning, when she came into the kitchen before dawn, there was a fresh cord of dry firewood stacked neatly against the kitchen wall. Split clean, good wood, the kind that catches fast and burns long. Nobody mentioned it. She didn't ask. She built the fire. The following days had a pattern to them that she was starting to read the way you learn to read weather, the small signs that told you what was coming before it arrived. Ryder's silences had gradations. The way the men moved around the table told her who was having a good day and who wasn't. Caleb's presence in the house followed a rhythm that she was beginning to understand, though she couldn't have explained it yet in words. He was there in the mornings, gone most of the day, and back in the evenings for supper. And after supper he sat in the front room with the accounts or whatever else he kept himself busy with, and he rarely spoke more than was necessary. He was, she thought, one of those men who had organized his grief into a daily schedule and stuck to it. She understood that. She'd done something similar herself. The difference was that her grief had a 5-year-old in it, and 5-year-olds have a way of making grief wait its turn, which is probably the best thing about them. Nora had attached herself to Tommy Briggs with the unself-conscious certainty of a child who has identified a kind person and intends to fully exploit that kindness. Tommy let her follow him when he did the lighter chores around the yard, teaching her the names of the horses with the patience of someone who liked explaining things. He was the one who showed her where Biscuit liked to be scratched behind the ears and which horses would take a piece of carrot from a small hand without being frightening about it. Eliza watched this from a careful distance. She was glad of it. She was also aware, in the back of her mind, that Tommy's warmth was not the ranch's official position on her daughter, and that the official position could still change. It was a Saturday, 16 days in, when the thing happened that changed the shape of everything. She had been in the kitchen since before dawn, as usual, and by mid-morning she was in the middle of the week's bread baking. 4 large loaves, the sourdough starter that she'd rebuilt from almost nothing in her first days there, a process that required attention and timing and couldn't be hurried, when she heard Nora's voice outside, not distressed, just calling, and then she heard Walter Boone's voice, low and even. She looked out the window. Nora was standing at the corner of the barn, pointing at something on the ground. Walter was crouching beside her, looking at whatever she'd found. He glanced up and saw Eliza watching from the window. He stood slowly, the way old men stand, joints doing their own negotiating with the process, and he picked up what Nora had found, and when he held it up, she could see it was a bird. Small, brown, the kind that were everywhere on the plains, lying still in his palm. Nora was asking him something. He was answering. Then he said something else, and Nora turned and looked at the window where her mother stood, and her face was very serious, the way it got when she was trying to understand something too big for her yet. Walter set the bird down gently at the base of the barn wall, in the thin patch of sunlight, and he said something to Nora that made her nod, and then he looked back up at Eliza and did something she hadn't seen him do since she'd arrived. He nodded. Just once. The same nod Caleb had given her the first night. But from Walter, it landed differently. She went back to her bread. Her hands were in the dough, and her mind was doing the thing it did. Running over the next 3 days' meals, calculating what was running low, thinking about the ham she needed to smoke before it turned, thinking about the temperature dropping outside and what that meant for the pipes. When she became aware that someone was standing in the kitchen doorway, she turned. It was Caleb. He wasn't in his usual position, arms loose at his sides, the stance of a man who was present but maintaining a careful distance from whatever was happening. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not aggressively, just like he'd been standing there a while and gotten comfortable with it, and he was watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You rebuilt the sourdough starter," he said. "There was the base of one in the crock on the low shelf. I fed it back up." "My wife started that," he said. "She brought it from her mother's house when we married. It was—" He stopped. "I didn't know there was anything left of it." Eliza looked at the rising dough in the bowl. She thought carefully about what to say, which was something she did more often than people realized. "It was a good starter, strong culture. That kind lasts if you keep it right." He was quiet for a moment. "She used to make bread on Saturdays," he said. "The whole house smelled like it." "It still does," she said, gently. Just the fact of it. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in that moment, just a moment, gone almost before it registered, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in any way she could point to. It was the kind of shift that happens between two people who have both been through something hard and recognize the marks of it in each other, the way certain animals do, without needing to name it. Then Caleb pushed off the doorframe, and the moment was over. "The riding crew needs to be out past midnight tonight, tracking some strays on the North Range," he said, back to practical. "I'll need a late supper kept warm." "I'll keep it warm," she said. He left. She stood with her hands in the dough and let the air settle back into the shape it had been before he walked in. The bread rose the way bread rises, slowly, patiently, doing what it was going to do regardless of whatever else was happening around it. She shaped the loaves and scored the tops the way her mother had scored them. Small diagonal cuts, a thing she did automatically without thinking, the way you carry the gestures of the people who loved you long after they're gone. When she pulled the bread from the oven that afternoon, the smell moved through the house the way Caleb had said. She set one loaf on the windowsill to cool, not beside the empty ceramic pot, just near it. Outside, the sky had gone the color of iron, heavy and low, pressing down on the horizon in a way that made her look at it twice on her way to the woodpile. The air had a smell to it, the particular cold electric smell that she'd grown up learning to read. Weather coming. She doubled the firewood she brought in. She put the extra beans to soak. She moved the water barrel inside from the back step. When Tommy came through the kitchen for a cup of coffee late that afternoon, she said, "Storm coming? Could be bad. Make sure the horses are secured." He looked at the sky through the window. "How do you know?" "Smell of the air, the way the clouds are sitting. My father used to say the sky tells you everything you need to know. You just have to listen to it right." Tommy looked at the sky again, then back at her, with the expression of a boy who is revising his opinion of someone upward and isn't sure how he feels about it yet. "I'll tell Ryder," he said. She nodded. She didn't tell him that Ryder probably already knew. Men like Ryder Cole always knew the things that made them competent, and reading weather was one of them. What Ryder Cole didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the storm coming was bigger than the sky was letting on. She knew. She went back inside and started cooking like they'd be feeding twice as many people as usual, because in her experience, that was always what a real storm turned out to need. The storm arrived without any further warning at 2:30 in the morning. Eliza heard it before she felt it. A sound like a freight train that wasn't stopping, a low, sustained roar that built from the northwest and hit the house all at once, and the windows flexed inward in their frames, and the whole structure groaned the way old wood groans when it's being tested past what it was built for. She was already awake. She'd been awake since midnight, the same instinct that had made her double the firewood and soak the extra beans, keeping her eyes open in the dark, listening to the sky do what it had been promising to do all evening. She got up before the sound finished settling. Nora didn't wake. The child slept through things the way only small children can, completely, without reservation, trusting entirely that the world would still be there in the morning. Eliza tucked the blanket up around her shoulders, lit the small lamp, and went to the kitchen. The temperature had dropped so fast in the night that the water in the pitcher on the shelf had a skim of ice on top. She broke it with her finger, filled the kettle, and put it on the stove, which she'd banked carefully before bed, and now opened up and fed more wood, building the heat back with the methodical attention of someone who understood that warmth in a storm wasn't a comfort, it was a strategy. Through the kitchen window, she could see nothing, just white. The snow was coming sideways, driven by a wind that hadn't made up its mind about direction yet, and the yard that she'd walked across 100 times in the past 16 days had disappeared entirely into a moving white wall. She started the first pot of coffee. Then she started calculating. She did it the way she always did, not with paper, though she sometimes wrote things down later, but in her head, running the numbers the way her father had run fence lines, end to end, no gaps. What was in the kitchen? What would be needed? How long a storm like this could last, and what men needed to function in the cold and the dark when everything was going wrong around them. She had 8 men in the bunkhouse. Caleb in the house. Tommy, who she knew slept like the dead and would be the last one awake. She checked the clock on the shelf. The night riding crew that Caleb had mentioned, the ones tracking strays on the North Range since before midnight. She didn't know how many were out. She didn't know how far. She was still calculating when the bunkhouse door banged open across the yard. She heard it even through the storm, and she could see the yellow blur of a lantern moving fast toward the house. It was Ryder Cole. He came through the back door without knocking, which was still his habit, and he was already pulling snow off his hat when he saw her standing at the stove with the coffee going, and for just a second, less than a second really, something crossed his face that wasn't his usual expression. Something that might have been relief, if Ryder Cole was the kind of man who admitted to relief, which he was not. "How many out on the range?" she asked, before he could say anything else. He looked at her. 9 riders. Went out at 10 to track the strays on the north side. Should have been back by now. He said it flat, like he was reading from a report, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the tight, controlled thing that a man like Ryder keeps below the surface when something is going wrong and he hasn't fixed it yet. Are they moving back toward the ranch? No way to know in this. When did the storm change direction? He paused. He hadn't expected that question. Little after midnight, started coming from the northwest instead of north. If they were still moving south to get home, the wind shift would have turned them around. She nodded. So they could be disoriented or sheltering somewhere. Could be. He said it like it cost him something. Then they'll need to get warm and eat the moment they get back, whatever time that is. I'll start cooking now. He was quiet for a moment, standing in her kitchen with snow still melting off his coat, and the look on his face was the look of a man trying to recalibrate something he'd already decided. It could be 6 hours, he said. Could be dawn, could be later. Then I'll cook till down and after, she said. You should go back to the bunkhouse and get the men up. They'll need to be ready to go out and meet the riders if they don't come in on their own. He stared at her. She turned back to the stove. Mrs. Mercer, he said, and stopped. She waited. The cook I hired to come in for the season, he said, slower now, the words coming out like he was choosing each one. Sent word yesterday. He's not coming. Some situation in Abilene. I was going to tell Whitaker this morning. She absorbed that, set it alongside everything else she was calculating. How long was he supposed to be here? Through the end of the cattle season. 6 weeks? Maybe 8. 6 to 8 weeks of a full working cattle operation. 3 meals a day for a crew that would expand when the seasonal workers arrived. It was more than she'd been managing, significantly more. And he was telling her now, in the middle of a storm, at 3 in the morning. She understood why. He wasn't asking her. He would never ask her. He was telling her because he had to tell someone, and there was no one else in the kitchen. Go wake your men, she said. Tell them there'll be hot food and coffee waiting when the riders get back. He left. She stood at the stove for a moment after the door closed, alone in the kitchen with the storm hammering the windows and the fire going and the coffee starting to boil. And she let herself feel the full weight of what the next hours were going to be, just for a moment, the way you let yourself feel something before you put it away and get on with the work. Then she got on with the work. The sourdough starter had been ready since the night before. She'd fed it in the afternoon and left it in the warmest corner of the kitchen, and it had done exactly what a good culture does when it's well maintained, risen to twice its size, and developed that sharp, living smell that meant it was ready. She started the first 2 loaves of bread, not because she'd have time to bake them before the riders returned, but because bread took time and she was thinking 3 steps ahead, the way she always did when the situation required it. Then she built the base of the stew. She had the ham bone she'd been saving since the beginning of the week. She always saved the bones, always, because bones were the beginning of everything in a working kitchen. And she put it in the large pot with water and the last of the onions and the dried sage and the peppercorns she kept in the small tin on the second shelf. While that came to a simmer, she cut the salt pork into cubes and rendered it in the heavy skillet, slowly, letting the fat come out and the edges crisp, because fat rendered right was the foundation of every sauce and gravy she knew, and she needed every flavor she could pull out of what the kitchen had. The beans went in with the ham. She started the biscuit dough. She moved between tasks the way she moved in any kitchen under pressure. Not fast exactly, but without wasted motion, each action connecting to the next with a kind of economy that came from years of cooking in places where there wasn't enough of anything, and you learned not to waste a step any more than you'd waste a grain of flour. An hour passed. The storm outside hadn't eased. If anything, it had deepened. The sound of it had gone from a roar to a lower, more sustained pressure, like a hand pressing flat against the outside of the house. The kitchen was warm. The coffee had been refilled twice. Through the window, she could see the lanterns moving in the bunkhouse across the yard, the shapes of men getting ready for whatever needed to be done. Caleb appeared in the doorway at 4:15. He was dressed for the cold, coat already on, hat in his hand. He looked at the stove, at the pots, at the rows of biscuit dough she'd laid on the baking sheet. He looked at her. "Ryder told me," he said. "About the riders or about the cook?" A pause. "Both. The riders will come back," she said. "Men who know this range know where to shelter. They'll wait out the worst of it and move when it breaks." "And if it doesn't break?" She looked at him. "Then we'll deal with that when we know it. Right now I'm cooking for when they get back. You should eat before you go out." He sat down at the kitchen table. She set a cup of coffee in front of him and a plate with biscuits from the batch she'd made at the start, already baked, already cooled slightly, and the last of the molasses in the jar, because she'd noticed he used it on biscuits the way some men use it on everything, methodically and without comment. He ate. She worked. They didn't talk, but the silence between them was different from the careful silence of the first days. It had a different texture to it, like a room where the furniture has been rearranged just enough that you move differently in it without being able to say exactly why. "My wife used to do this," he said, not looking up from the plate. "Be up before anyone else when something was wrong, like she heard trouble coming before it arrived." Eliza kept her hands moving. Flour, lard, salt. Some people are built that way. She said it wasn't a gift, said it was just anxiety that made itself useful. Eliza almost smiled. That's one way to describe it. Caleb pushed back from the table. He stood and picked up his hat and settled it. He looked at her once more, and then at the kitchen, at all of it. The stove going, the bread rising, the big pot of stew building its foundation for the hours ahead. And whatever he was thinking stayed inside, the way most things did with him. "I'll be back when I can," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He went out into the storm. The next hours were the longest of her time at Blackstone Ranch, and they were also, in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't lived something similar, the clearest. She cooked. She kept the fire. She managed the heat of the stove the way you manage something that can either help you or burn you depending on your attention, never fully away from it, coming back every few minutes to adjust a damper or shift a pot. The bread went in when the oven reached the right temperature. She tested it the old way, holding her hand near the open door, counting in her head, a trick her mother's mother had taught her before thermometers were common in ranch kitchens. The stew deepened in color and smell. The ham bone giving up everything it had into the broth, the beans softening, the whole pot becoming something that smelled like it had been cooking for days instead of hours. Biscuit, the dog, had come to the back door somewhere around 5 in the morning, scratching once, and she'd let him in without debate because a dog shouldn't be outside in this, and she wasn't made of stone. He settled under the work table and stayed there, tracking her movements with his eyes, but too cold and sensible to do anything but rest. Nora woke at 6. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with her hair in the braids she slept in, blinking against the lamplight, and the first thing she said was, "Is it bad outside?" "Yes," Eliza said. "Come sit by the stove." Nora came and sat on the stool she'd claimed as hers in the first week, the low three-legged one near the warmth of the firebox. And she looked at the dog under the table and at all the pots going and at her mother moving between them, and she said, with the uncanny accuracy of small children who absorb more than anyone knows, "Are the men lost?" "Some of them might be confused about where they are," Eliza said carefully. "They'll find their way back." "How do you know?" She thought about the honest answer versus the useful one and decided her daughter deserved the honest one. "I don't know for certain, but they've been working this range a long time, and people who know a piece of land can usually find their way home across it even when they can't see. The land tells you things if you've been listening to it long enough." Nora thought about this. "Like how you knew the storm was coming?" "Exactly like that." The child pulled her knees up on the stool and watched the stove. "I'm hungry," she announced. Eliza fed her. Tommy Briggs arrived at the back door at 6:30, stomping snow off his boots, with his hat pulled down and his coat dark with wet. He came in and stood dripping on the floor mat and looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man who has been outside in a blizzard for 2 hours and cannot believe the warmth and smell that exists on the other side of a door. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and his voice had that particular thickness that comes from cold pushing into your lungs. "Mr. Cole says to tell you the first riders are coming in off the South Range. About 7 of them. They sheltered in the old line shack off Creek Road." "How long till they're here?" 20 minutes, maybe 30. They're moving slow. Pete Calder's horse threw a shoe and he's walking it." "Are they hurt?" "Cold. Hungry. Calder might have frost nip on his hands. Cole's not sure yet." He paused. "The other 2, Morrison and the new hand, Davis. Nobody knows where they are yet." The kitchen went quiet for a moment, just the sound of the storm and the fire and Nora's careful breathing from her stool. "All right," Eliza said. "When they get here, bring them straight to the dining room. I want their boots off and dry clothes on before they eat. There should be extra wool socks in the cedar chest in the hall. Caleb's probably, but he won't argue about it tonight. And tell Mr. Cole I'll need more firewood in 20 minutes. Tommy nodded. "And Tommy," she looked at him, "eat something before you go back out." He sat down at the kitchen table and she put a bowl of stew in front of him and he ate it in about 4 minutes without coming up for air. And she watched him out of the corner of her eye and thought about how young he was, and how young they all were, and how much work it took to keep young men alive in a place like this, and how the world didn't give that work much credit. He left. She kept cooking. The first group of riders came in just after 7. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of horses in the yard, voices calling back and forth, the creak of the barn doors. Then boots on the front steps, and the front door opening, and Ryder Cole's voice in the hallway, directing men like a man who has a system even when everything around him is chaos. They came into the dining room in various states. Some of them were steady enough on their feet. 2 of them moved with the careful deliberateness of men whose bodies had been through something and were still deciding how to report back about it. Pete Calder's hands were wrapped in cloth. Someone had done a rough job of it out there. Good enough to get him home, not good enough for what came next. Eliza brought the first pot of stew out herself. She set it in the middle of the table with the ladle and the bowls she'd stacked, and she didn't say anything, just let the smell do what smell does in a room full of cold and exhausted people. 7 men looked at that pot with the kind of expression that has nothing to do with manners or performance. The raw, uncomplicated need of a person who is cold and hasn't eaten in a long time and is suddenly, unexpectedly, being offered warmth. They served themselves. She went back for the bread. She brought the bread out on the board she'd cut it on, 2 full loaves, sliced, the crust still holding its crackle, and she set it alongside the pot of butter she'd pulled from the cold box. And she went back for more coffee, And by the time she came back to the dining room again, the bread was half gone and the first pot of stew was down to the bottom, and 3 of the men were looking like they might be capable of speech. Walt Boone was among them. He'd been one of the group in the line shack, it turned out. He sat at the far end of the table with a second bowl of stew in front of him, working through it steadily. And when she came to collect the empty breadboard, he looked up at her and said quietly, for her ears only, "Red River Station. You fed a crew of 23 through 3 days without a supply wagon." She picked up the board. "Something like that." "I remembered wrong," he said. "It was 26, and you did it with half a kitchen." She looked at him. "I didn't put it together till just now," he said. "Your name, your face. I should have seen it earlier." There was something in his voice, not apology exactly, but the sound of a man adjusting his position based on new information, which in her experience was as close as most men of his generation got to apology. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Some things you don't forget," he said. "Good food in a bad time is one of them." She went back to the kitchen. Pete Calder's hands needed attention. She'd known it since he came in, had been tracking him out of the corner of her eye while managing the food. The cloth wrapping was soaked through and the skin beneath, when she unwound it at the kitchen table while Tommy held the lamp, was white in patches and red at the edges. Frost nip, not frostbite, the difference mattering enormously. And he sat there with his jaw set and his eyes somewhere else while she worked. Warm water, not hot. This was the thing people got wrong, always. They reached for heat when they found cold, and heat on frostnip was damage on top of damage. She used water that was just above body temperature, and she held his hands in it herself, because the basin needed to stay steady, and she couldn't trust him to hold it when his hands had no feeling in them yet. "Am I going to lose them?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the thing underneath it. "No," she said. "Not if we do this right." "You sure?" "I've seen worse come back," she said, which was true. "You got here fast enough. The wrapping kept the worst off. You're going to have pain when the feeling comes back, but that's the feeling coming back, which is what you want." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That cook we hired. Ryder told me tonight he's not coming." "I know. That's 6 weeks of cattle season with no cook." She kept his hands in the water, kept her eyes on what she was doing. "One problem at a time, Mr. Calder." The feeling came back to his hands over the next 30 minutes, and it came back the way she'd warned him it would. With pain, first the pins and needles, and then something sharper, and he made a sound low in his throat that he immediately tried to swallow, and she said, "Let it hurt. That means it's working." And he looked at her with watery eyes and something that might have been gratitude or might have been just the involuntary expression of someone in pain who has someone calm next to them. She bound his hands properly, wrapped them well, and told him no work for 3 days and to keep them warm. And she said it the way she said things that were not suggestions, and he nodded. He was halfway out of the kitchen when he turned back. "The other 2, he said, "Morrison and Davis. Morrison knows this range. He'll find cover." He paused. "Davis is green. Came up from San Antonio, never worked a range winter before." She absorbed that. "Is there anywhere specific on the North Range they'd shelter?" "There's a dry creek bed about 4 miles out, northeast. Cuts down into the earth enough to break the wind. Morrison knows it. If he's got his head on, that's where they'll be." She nodded. He left. She went to find Caleb. He was in the front room, which she'd been in exactly twice since her arrival. Both times briefly, both times for practical reasons. It was a spare room, not austere but not comfortable, the kind of space kept functional rather than lived in. The accounts were on the desk, untouched from this morning. He was at the window looking out at the white void of the yard. She told him what Calder had said. The dry creek bed, the northeast range, Morrison knowing it. He turned from the window and looked at her for a moment. "I know it. We used to camp there during the spring drives. Is it accessible in this?" "On horseback, if you know the way." He said it without inflection, but she could see in his face the calculation he was running. The same calculation she'd been running all morning, just with different variables. The risk of going out in this. The risk of leaving 2 men in the field. "Ryder can't go," she said. "He's got the 7 who just came in to manage, and Calder can't ride." "I know," he said. "Tommy knows the range. Tommy's 20 years old. Walter Boone came in with the first group. He's cold, but he's steady." Caleb looked at her. There was something in the look that she recognized. The look of a person who is trying to decide whether to be annoyed that someone else has already thought through their problem or grateful for it. "I'll take Walter and two of the steadier ones," he said. "We'll go out in an hour, when the wind drops enough to move." She nodded and turned to go. "Mrs. Mercer." She stopped. "Keep the stove going," he said. It wasn't just about the stove, and they both knew it, but that was how he said things, wrapped in the practical. "I will," she said. She went back to the kitchen and she kept the stove going. The storm peaked somewhere around and began slowly to ease, not all at once, but the way pressure releases, in gradual steps, the wind dropping in intervals, the snow coming lighter, the darkness outside the window shifting toward a gray that had some light mixed into it. At 11:15 she heard horses in the yard. She was at the stove, adding wood, and she heard the horses and she heard voices, and she went to the back door and opened it, and the cold came in like a wall, and through the thinning snow she could see them coming across the yard. Caleb and Walter and two others, and between them, two more shapes on horseback, moving slowly. Morrison and Davis. Davis was barely in the saddle. He was slumped forward with his hands on the pommel and his head down, and when they got him off the horse, Tommy and Ryder took him off between them. He couldn't hold his own weight at first, just leaned against Tommy with his eyes half open and his face the color of ash. Eliza had the kitchen ready. She had warm blankets from the hall chest, the ones she'd pulled earlier and set by the stove to heat. She had the warm water basin ready. She had a bowl of stew and a cup of coffee, and she knew from experience that the coffee came first, that the smell of coffee was the first thing that reached a man who had been so cold he'd stopped being sure of things, and that it mattered before the food, before the warmth, before anything, because it told the brain that things were about to be better. She pressed the coffee into Davis's hands herself. His hands that were cold but not as bad as Calder's, thanked the particular luck of the dry creek bed that had broken the worst of the wind. And she curled his fingers around the cup and held them there until she felt him grip it himself. He looked up at her. He was maybe 25. He looked younger right now. He looked like a person who had spent the last several hours genuinely uncertain whether he was going to see the inside of this house again. "You're all right," she said. "You're inside now. You're warm." He nodded. His eyes were wet, and she wasn't sure if it was the cold or something else, and she didn't ask, just left her hand on his for another second, and then stepped back and let Tommy take over, because sometimes what a person needs when they've been through something is another person, their own age, who'll tease them gently about it later and make it survivable in memory. She went back to the stove. Ryder Cole was standing at the kitchen doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He had his hat in his hand and his coat was dark with melted snow, and his face had the look of a man who'd been outside in bad weather and hadn't allowed himself to process any of it yet, because there was still work to do, and that was the only mode he had. She lifted the coffee pot in his direction. A question. He crossed the kitchen and held out his cup, and she poured and he drank, and for a moment they stood in the same space without anything between them. No performance, no testing, no positioning. Just two people in a warm kitchen after a hard night, with coffee, and the sound of the storm easing outside. "Where'd you learn to handle frost nip?" he said. "Railroad camps. We had a company doctor for about 3 months, then he went south and we managed ourselves." Ryder looked into his coffee. "Davis would have lost fingers. Maybe worse." "Maybe," she said. "But he didn't." He was quiet for a long moment, then, "The cook's not coming, you know that." "I know. That's 8 weeks of cattle season, full crew, plus seasonal riders starting in 3 weeks. That's 30 men at peak, maybe more." "I know," she said again. He looked at her directly, the way he did when he was being straight with someone, which she'd come to recognize as a thing he did rarely but completely when he did it. "Can you handle it?" She looked at him back. "I handled tonight, didn't I?" Something moved across Ryder Cole's face that she had never seen there before. It didn't have a clean name. It was somewhere between respect and discomfort, and the specific expression of a man who is revising a conclusion he'd drawn early and held on to stubbornly, and finding the revision uncomfortable but undeniable. He didn't say anything. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down on the work table and put his hat back on, and walked to the back door, and he paused with his hand on the frame, and without turning around he said, "I'll make sure the wood gets stacked before supper." Then he walked out into the fading storm. Eliza stood at the stove. Outside, the wind had dropped to something manageable. The yard was visible again. white and thick with snow, the barn dark against the sky, the bunkhouse with its small window glowing yellow. Through the cleared air, she could see the tracks the men had made coming in, the deep-pressed places where horses had moved through the drifts, and the smaller single tracks where people had walked. She thought about all of it, the past weeks, the morning, the men who'd made it back, the one who'd almost not. She thought about Ryder Cole's back as he walked away, and what it had cost him to say that, and how she understood the cost better than he probably knew. She thought about the sourdough starter that had been someone else's, that was now feeding this house. She thought about the ceramic pot on the windowsill, still empty, still there. The bread she'd put in at 7 had been cooling on the shelf since 9, and she'd been so deep in everything else that she hadn't had a moment to look at it properly. She looked at it now. 4 loaves, golden, the scored tops spread open along the cuts the way they were supposed to, the crust holding its shape. She cut a slice from the end of one loaf and ate it standing at the work table because she hadn't eaten since before the storm began, and she was hungrier than she'd let herself notice. It was good bread, not perfect. The bottom crust was a little darker than she liked, from the oven running hot in the early morning when the fire was freshest. But it was good. She ate the slice and cut another one, and she stood in the warm kitchen with the storm easing off outside and all 16 men accounted for and safe inside. And she let herself feel the quiet satisfaction of that without trying to name it or make it larger than it was. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't proof of anything, not yet, not permanently. It was just this, a hard night managed, a fire kept, people fed and warm who might otherwise not have been. For now, that was enough. The afternoon shifted toward early, the way winter afternoons do, fast and without much ceremony, and the lamps came on one by one throughout the house, and the kitchen stayed warm, and Eliza started on supper because there was always supper, and there always would be, and that was the work, and she had known from the beginning that the work was the point. The snow stayed on the ground for 11 days. It didn't melt so much as surrender, gradually, in the particular grudging way of hard winters that don't want to admit they're done. The yard turned from white to gray to a tracked-up mud that stuck to everything and got carried into the kitchen a dozen times a day, no matter how many times she put the boot scraper to use. The men came in from the cold with the smell of wet wool and horse and hard work, and the kitchen absorbed all of it. The cold they brought in with them, the noise, the hunger, and turned it into something manageable, the way a kitchen does when someone is running it right. Eliza had stopped counting the days. She'd started counting meals instead, which was a more honest measure of what her life at Blackstone Ranch actually consisted of. Breakfast at 5, noon meal at 12 if the crew was near enough to the house, supper at 6 with the full table. 3 meals a day for 9 permanent hands, plus Caleb, plus Tommy, who ate like he was trying to store up for hibernation, plus the 2 seasonal riders who'd arrived the week after the storm to start the early prep for cattle season. 13 mouths, plus Nora, plus the occasional extra. When a neighboring rancher stopped in and Caleb invited them to stay, which happened more than she'd expected, she'd learned to cook for 15 as her baseline and adjust upward. The cattle season itself was still 3 weeks away, but the work building toward it had the whole ranch running at a different pitch. Tighter, faster, men up before dawn and working past dark. The mood around the table shifting from the relative looseness of a normal week to something more focused and a little ragged at the edges. She felt it in how they ate, faster, quieter, eyes on the food and not on each other. She felt it in how the coffee disappeared before she'd finished pouring the first round. She adjusted. She started making bigger breakfasts. Added cornmeal mush with the biscuits, the kind that sticks to a man's ribs from 5 in the morning until noon. She moved supper earlier by 30 minutes, so the men could get to bed before 8 if they needed to. She started keeping a pot of something warm on the back of the stove all day. Not a full meal, just broth and whatever was close to hand, because she'd noticed that the men who came in at odd hours between meals weren't eating anything, and a man running on empty makes mistakes in ways that cost more than a pot of broth. Nobody asked her to do any of this. She just did it. Ryder noticed first, of course. He noticed everything about the operation of the ranch the way a foreman does. Not because he was sentimental about it, but because anything that affected the functioning of his crew was his business, and he tracked it accordingly. He came into the kitchen one Tuesday morning, earlier than usual, and stood at the work table while she was starting the biscuit dough, and he said without preamble, The midday broth. That your idea? Yes. Morrison said it kept him going on the fence line yesterday when he missed the noon meal. Good. Ryder was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to say the next thing. It's a smart adjustment, he said, for the season. She kept her hands in the dough. Thank you, Mr. Cole. He left. She allowed herself a small, private expression of satisfaction that lasted about 3 seconds before she went back to the biscuits. The relationship between her and Ryder Cole had shifted after the storm, the way ground shifts after a hard freeze and thaw. The surface looked similar, but the structure underneath had changed, and if you pressed on it, you could feel the difference. He wasn't warm. He was never going to be warm, she understood that. It wasn't in his nature the way warmth was in Tommy's nature, that easy, unguarded openness that some people carry without even knowing it. Ryder Cole's version of thawing was functional. He stopped working against her, which was, in its own way, more useful than warmth. He told the hands the wood got stacked before supper, and the wood got stacked. He told Morrison to stop leaving the back gate open when he came in from the south range, because the wind came through and hit the kitchen and Eliza needed consistent temperature for the bread, and Morrison stopped leaving it open. He didn't announce these things. He just managed them, quietly, the way he managed everything, and she understood that this was Ryder Cole's version of an apology, extended over several weeks in practical gestures, and she accepted it in the same language. Walter Boone had started coming to the kitchen in the evenings. Not for food. Supper was long over by the time he appeared, usually around 8, after the other men had gone back to the bunkhouse or turned in early. He'd come in and sit at the kitchen table with a cup of whatever was still warm in the pot, and he'd either talk or not talk, depending on the night, and she'd be cleaning up or preparing for the next morning. And it was, she realized after the third or fourth time, simply company. The kind that older people fall into when they find someone who doesn't require them to perform or explain themselves. He told her about the ranch in its earlier years, when there'd been more hands and a different kind of energy to the place. He told her about the cattle drives he'd ridden before the railroads changed everything, the long months of moving a herd north through weather and terrain that had no interest in cooperating, the particular brotherhood of men who'd done that work. He told her these things the way people tell stories that are finished, not with nostalgia exactly, but with the settled quality of someone who has made peace with what's gone. She told him less, but she told him some things. About the railroad camps, the years between her husband's death and this place. About the particular exhaustion of being competent in situations where your competence was inconvenient to the people around you. About Nora, who she talked about carefully, the way you talk about something precious that you're afraid of naming too directly in case the naming draws bad luck toward it. She's going to be something, Walter said one night, about Nora. You can see it. Same way you could see certain horses were something before they showed you. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She's already something. Walter smiled. Not a big smile. He wasn't a big smile kind of man, but the real kind. Fair point. The thing with Caleb was harder to describe because it moved slowly and sideways, and neither of them was helping it move exactly. They were just both present in the same house, day after day, and the daily business of that presence accumulated. He came to the kitchen most mornings now, not always to eat, sometimes just for coffee, standing at the work table or sitting briefly, reading whatever needed to be read about the day's work. Sometimes he talked, in the spare, practical way he talked, about the ranch, the season coming, the decisions that needed to be made. Sometimes he said nothing, and she said nothing, and they were simply two people in the same warm room at 5:30 in the morning while the rest of the world was dark and cold. She'd started learning his patterns without intending to. The way he took his coffee, black, no sweetening, but the cup refilled twice and the second cup slower than the first. The way he read, his shoulders slightly forward, his right hand flat on the table, as if he needed the anchor of something solid. The way he looked at the empty doorway of the front room sometimes in the evening, just for a second, the way people look at places where something used to be. She didn't address any of it. That wasn't her place. But she noticed, and noticing was a thing she couldn't turn off. It was Nora who complicated everything, the way children complicate everything. Not out of malice or even awareness, just out of the pure and unstoppable fact of being themselves. She'd been following Caleb. Not constantly, not obviously, but in the particular way that young children follow people they've decided are interesting, gravitating toward them in rooms, appearing near them at odd moments, doing their own quiet business in close proximity. Eliza had noticed it for about 2 weeks before she mentioned it to no one and decided to watch what happened. What happened was, Caleb let her. He didn't engage her, not at first. He'd come into the kitchen and Nora would be on her stool, and he'd get his coffee and stand at the work table, and Nora would look at him with those eyes that saw everything, and he'd not quite look at her, and the whole exchange was a kind of non-conversation that had its own grammar. Then one morning, Eliza came back from the wood store to find them both at the kitchen table. Nora had her small collection of buttons. She carried them in a cloth bag, had been adding to it since before Eliza could remember, picking them up wherever she found them, spread out on the table, sorting them by some system that was entirely her own. Caleb was sitting across from her with his coffee, watching. "That one's different from the others," he was saying, pointing. Not condescendingly, just as an observation. "That's a bone button," Nora said. "Walter gave it to me. He said it came off a coat he had in the war." "That's so." Caleb looked at the button more closely. "Walter doesn't talk about the war much. He said it was a long time ago and some things are better as buttons than as stories." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's about right," he said. Eliza had stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them saw her, and she'd felt something move through her chest that she didn't look at directly, because some things are better not examined too closely while you're still in the middle of them. Then Nora saw her and said, "Mama, Mr. Whitaker says the brown horse is named Captain because he acts like he's in charge of all the other horses." And the moment was just a morning again. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the storm, in the form of a man named Gerald Sutton. He came on horseback, alone, in the early afternoon, and he was the kind of man who was well-dressed enough for his quality of clothing to be the first thing you noticed. A good coat, a good hat, boots that had been expensive when new and were still being maintained carefully. He had the practiced ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and being received well, and he came into the yard and swung down from his horse and looked around with the proprietary interest of a man assessing something he might want. Eliza saw him through the kitchen window. She didn't know who he was, but she knew the type, and she felt the particular wariness that the type produced in her, the low-level alertness of someone who has learned to read a certain kind of confidence as a warning sign rather than a reassurance. Caleb received him in the front room. She heard the voices, not the words, just the tones, which told her enough. Caleb's voice was careful, flat, in the way it got when he was managing something. The visitor's voice was expansive, easy, the voice of a man who had not yet been told no. She found out the nature of it that evening. Caleb came to the kitchen after supper, late when the table was cleared and the dishes done and Nora was already asleep. And he sat down at the kitchen table and he said, "Gerald Sutton came today. I saw him. He runs the Sutton operation east of Colton, bigger spread. He's been buying up land on this side of the county for 2 years. A pause. He wants to buy Blackstone. She stopped what she was doing, turned around. Caleb's face was doing the thing where it went carefully neutral, which she'd learned meant the opposite of neutral. He made an offer, a fair offer, numerically. Are you considering it? He looked at the table. He'll come back next week for an answer. She waited. He also said, Caleb stopped, looked up at her. He's heard about your cooking, said his operation has been looking for a head cook for the bunkhouse, offered you a position, better wage than what I'm paying. The kitchen was very quiet. I see, she said. He was flattering about it, said his crew of 40 needs someone who can handle a serious operation. He was here for less than 2 hours, she said. He hasn't eaten my food. No, he's heard from men who have. Writers talk. She absorbed that. And you're telling me this because you should know, he said, simply. Because it's your choice to make. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on the shelf threw a warm, uneven light across the kitchen, and Caleb Whitaker sat at the table with his hands flat on the wood. That anchoring gesture, that need for something solid. And his face was neutral, and his eyes were not. Is this your way of asking whether I'm staying? She said. Something moved in his face. I don't have the right to ask that. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. The fire in the stove settled with a soft sound. Outside, the wind was low and steady, nothing like the storm, just the ordinary winter night voice of the plains. I want you to stay, he said. That's the truth of it. But I've got no claim on you, and Sutton's offering more money, and I'm not going to be the man who... He stopped again. Who what? She said. Who keeps someone here because it's convenient for him? She looked at him for a long time. Caleb, she said. First time she'd used his given name, and she felt it land between them, and she kept going. I will deal with Gerald Sutton when he comes back. You worry about the ranch. He looked up. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Not for Gerald Sutton's money. Not for his 40-man bunkhouse. She turned back to the counter. But thank you for telling me. He sat there for another minute. Then he got up and went to the front room, and she heard the creak of his chair as he sat down at the desk. She finished putting the kitchen to order for the morning, moving quietly in the lamplight. And she didn't look in the direction of the front room, and she didn't examine too closely what she'd just said or why, because some things are clearer when you don't look directly at them and just let them be what they are. Gerald Sutton came back the following Wednesday, as promised. She was ready for him, not in any dramatic way. She hadn't planned anything, hadn't rehearsed anything. She'd just been thinking the way she thought when she was managing a kitchen, practically several steps ahead, what's available and what's possible and how to close the distance. He appeared in the yard at 11 in the morning, and this time he brought a second man with him, younger, who carried a leather satchel and wore the expression of someone whose job it is to make numbers look reasonable. Caleb received them in the front room again. Eliza served coffee. She came in with the tray. Good cups, not the bunkhouse tin ones, the china cups that had been at the back of the cabinet since before she arrived. And Sutton looked up at her with the practiced approval of a man who has sized up many situations quickly and said, Mrs. Mercer, I've been wanting to meet you properly. Mr. Sutton, she said. You've made quite an impression on this territory, he said, for someone who's only been here. 8 weeks, she said. Give or take? She set the tray down. I heard you've made an offer on the ranch. Sutton glanced at Caleb, then back at her. He was recalibrating. She could see it, the tiny adjustment in how he positioned himself in the chair. He hadn't expected to be addressed directly. I've made an offer, yes. A generous one. And a separate offer to me, she said. A position at the Sutton operation. Head cook, full kitchen staff under you, significantly better wages. I imagine it's an appealing prospect. She poured his coffee. What's your bunkhouse situation? He blinked. I'm sorry? Your bunkhouse. How many men? What's the kitchen setup? What's the supply situation? If I were considering your offer, those are the things I'd want to know. He recovered quickly. She gave him that. 42 men in peak season. Full kitchen, good supply lines from the rail depot in Colton. I'd want you to run it independently, full control over menu and staffing. And the wages you mentioned. He named a figure. It was, as Caleb had said, significantly better than what she was making. She picked up the coffee tray. She looked at Sutton, and she thought about what she knew about men like him, which was quite a lot by now. Men who moved through a territory buying things. Men who were generous when the acquisition was still in progress, and different after the papers were signed. Men who called women like her an appealing prospect without quite meaning the words the way they sounded. Thank you for the offer, she said. My answer is no. Sutton's expression shifted. Mrs. Mercer, I'm exactly where I intend to be, she said. She looked at Caleb once, brief, steady, and then back at Sutton. If you'll excuse me, I have a noon meal to get ready. She went back to the kitchen. She heard Sutton's voice, lower, in the front room, the tone of a man redirecting to what he'd actually come for, which was the ranch itself and not her. She knew that. She'd never been the point of it. She heard Caleb's voice even, and then she stopped listening because it wasn't her business and the beans needed attention. What she did hear clearly through the kitchen wall was the moment Caleb said, I'm not selling, Gerald. That's my final answer. She didn't react to it. She kept stirring the beans. She heard Sutton's boots on the front floor, then the door, then hoofbeats going away across the yard, and the sound of the door closing, and then quiet. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later. She didn't turn around. You didn't have to do that, he said. Refuse like that in front of him. I know, she said. I did it because it was what I'd already decided, and there was no reason to wait. He was quiet. Are you angry? She asked. No, he said. And then, no, I'm not. She heard him move closer, not to the table, but to the window. Standing at the window the way he stood when he was working through something. "I almost sold," he said. "Before you came. I almost wrote back to Sutton and told him yes. The ranch was struggling. Cook was gone. I thought maybe the time for this place had passed." She turned around now. He was looking out the window at the yard, at the barn, at the range beyond it. All of it white-edged and winter gray, and still unmistakably his. "What changed?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone rebuilt the sourdough starter," he said. It was such a quiet thing to say, such an oblique, careful way of saying it. She stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in her hand, and she felt the whole weight of the last 8 weeks settle into a different shape, and she thought about all the things that had been rebuilt here, in small and practical ways that were also something else. The fire she built every morning. The bread she'd made from the starter that had been someone else's. The lock she'd reinstalled herself. The dog on the back step. The window box she'd asked Tommy to fill with dirt last week. Nothing planted in it yet. Too cold still. But there, waiting. "The cattle season starts in 2 weeks," she said, because she was not yet ready to say the other things, and there was always work to come back to. "It does," he said. "You're going to need more supplies. The cornmeal is low. I need more salt and baking powder, and the coffee supply at the current rate of consumption won't last through February." He turned from the window. The expression on his face was complicated and quiet, and she held it for just a second before going back to the beans. "I'll put an order in tomorrow," he said. "Add dried apples if they have them," she said. "I want to make a pie when the season starts. Men work harder when there's something to look forward to at the end of it." She heard him almost say something, and then stop, and then the sound of him at the door. "Eliza." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She nodded, her back still to him, her hands still on the pot. He left. The noon meal was good that day. The beans she'd been building since morning, thick and deep-flavored, with cornbread and the last of the smoked meat from the hook above the back door. The table filled at 12 with cold, hungry men who ate the way they always ate now, without the performance of indifference they'd had in the early weeks. Just eating, just people being fed by someone who knew what they needed and had made sure it was there. Ryder ate 2 full bowls and didn't comment. Walter Boone looked up at her when she refilled the bread plate and said, in his quiet way, "Word around Colton is that Sutton's been making offers all across this side of the county. 6 ranches turned him down last year, kept coming back." "I've noticed he's persistent," she said. "He offered the Carey spread triple what it was worth, and old August Carey still said no." Walter looked at his bowl. "There's things money doesn't cover." "Yes," she said. "There are." "Tommy," from the far end of the table, "is he going to keep coming back here?" "Probably," she said. "What do we do?" She looked around the table, the 8 faces she'd been feeding for 8 weeks, the 2 newer ones, all of them looking at her with a directness that would have surprised her on the first day, when they'd looked through her, or past her, or at her, only to measure how quickly she'd leave. "The same thing we've been doing," she said. "The work." She went back to the kitchen. Pete called her, whose hands had healed completely. She'd checked them herself, pressed the joints carefully until he'd pulled away, telling her they were fine, which they were, caught her at the kitchen door on his way out. He stopped and looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has been taken care of and hasn't forgotten it. "For what it's worth," he said, "there's not a man at that table who'd rather be at Sutton's operation." She looked at him. "Just so you know," he said, and went back to work. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, holding that. Then she went inside and started on supper. Outside, the last of the snow on the yard was finally starting to give up the edges of itself, the mud showing through in the places where it got the most foot traffic, dark and rich and smelling of something about to begin. The season was coming. The work ahead was bigger than anything she'd managed yet at this ranch, and she knew it, and she was already calculating. Supplies, timing, the additional hands that would arrive and need feeding from the first morning. She was also thinking about dried apples, about the pie she'd make when the season started, about the look on a table full of tired men's faces when something unexpected good arrived at the end of a long day, and what that was worth, and how you couldn't put a number on it, and how Sutton never would have understood that even if she'd tried to explain it to him. She started the supper fire. She always started the fire. And the kitchen filled with warmth the way it did every evening now, as naturally as breathing, as necessary as anything else that kept this place alive. The cattle season arrived the way hard things arrive. Not all at once, but in accumulating pressure, each day a little heavier than the last until the weight of it was just the normal condition of your life, and you stopped noticing it as unusual. The first of the seasonal riders came in on a Monday in late January. 3 men from down near the hill country who smelled of long road and had the particular lean, watchful quality of men who moved from ranch to ranch with the seasons and had learned not to get attached to any of it. By Wednesday, there were 9 more. By the end of the first week of February, Eliza was cooking for 31 men, plus Caleb, plus Nora, plus whoever happened to be passing through, and the kitchen ran from 4 in the morning until 7 at night without a genuine stop. She had asked for help, and Caleb had hired it. A girl from Colton, 16 years old, named Jessie Vane, who was strong and quick and willing to learn, and had the sense not to ask unnecessary questions when things were moving fast. Jessie washed and peeled and stirred what she was told to stir, and she learned fast. And by the second week, she was anticipating things without being told, and Eliza decided she was the best investment the ranch had made in a long time and told Caleb so directly. He'd looked faintly amused by the directness. "I'll tell her father," he said. "Tell her," Eliza said. "She's the one doing the work." The days blurred. That was the only honest way to describe it. The individual days lost their edges and merged into a continuous thing that was defined by tasks rather than hours. Bread, then biscuits, then the big breakfast, then the noon meal if the crew was near enough, then supper, then the cleaning, then the prep for tomorrow, then a few hours of the particular exhausted stillness that isn't quite sleep and isn't quite rest, but is what the body settles for when sleep is a luxury. She made the pie. She'd been saving the dried apples since before the season started, keeping them in the tin on the high shelf where Jessie couldn't reach without a step, and where the temptation of them wouldn't produce any unauthorized disappearances. She made the pie on the 3rd Friday of the cattle season, the end of the first full hard week, when the crew came in from the range later than usual, smelling of dust and cattle, and the particular exhaustion that comes from days of sustained physical work and cold that hadn't yet decided to turn toward spring. She put it on the table at the end of supper. 1 pie for 32 people was not, mathematically, a satisfying portion. She knew that. She'd made it anyway because the point was never the portion. The point was the arrival of it, the unexpected thing at the end of a hard day, the signal that someone had thought ahead to the moment when they'd need something beyond sustenance. The table went quiet when she set it down. Then Morrison, the one who'd been out in the storm, who'd sheltered Davis in the dry creek bed through the worst of that night, who'd come home at noon the next day with ice in his beard and said not a word about any of it. Morrison looked at the pie and said, in a voice that was purely involuntary, "Is that apple?" "It is," she said. The quiet that followed had a different quality from the quiet she'd walked into on her first night. That had been the quiet of men withholding themselves, waiting to see if she'd earned their attention. This was the quiet of men who had stopped performing anything at all, who were just present in a warm room at the end of a long day with something good in front of them that they hadn't expected. Ryder Cole, at his end of the table, looked at the pie and then at her, and said nothing, but the look said enough. She cut it and served it, and the portions were small, and nobody complained, and Tommy ate his in approximately 45 seconds and looked at the empty plate with an expression of genuine loss that made Jessie laugh from the kitchen doorway, and the table laughed with her, and the sound of it moved through the house the way warmth moves, into the corners, into the high parts of the ceiling, into the places that had been cold for a long time. Eliza stood at the edge of it and let it happen around her. The weeks that followed had a rhythm she'd worked hard to establish and harder to maintain. The cattle season at full operation was an organism with its own demands. Things went wrong every day because things always went wrong at full operation, and the quality of a kitchen under that kind of sustained pressure was defined not by the good days, but by how the bad ones got handled. The day the salt pork delivery came short by a third, and she had to rebuild the week's meal plan in her head in about 10 minutes. The morning the stove's firebox cracked, and she cooked an entire breakfast for 32 men on 2 campfires she and Tommy built in the yard, while Caleb rode to Colton for a replacement part. The afternoon, Jessie cut her hand badly enough to need binding and was out of commission for 2 days, and Eliza ran the kitchen alone until a neighboring rancher's wife, Hearing about it somehow through the particular telegraph of Frontier Women's Networks, showed up on Tuesday morning with her sleeves already rolled up and said, "Tell me what you need." Her name was Clara Ames, and she was built like someone had designed her specifically for hard work, and she could make biscuits almost as fast as Eliza could, and they worked side by side for 2 days without anything beyond the necessary words, which was, Eliza thought, one of the best kinds of company there was. She came back the following week just to visit, and the week after that, and at some point it stopped being visiting and started being the thing itself, and Eliza found herself with a friend, which was something she hadn't had in a long time and hadn't realized she'd been missing as badly as she had. Clara was 43, had been on the Texas frontier for 15 years, and had opinions about everything that she delivered without apology and revised without embarrassment when new information arrived, which was the most useful combination of qualities Eliza had ever encountered in another person. "Caleb Whitaker's been different this season," Clara said one afternoon in early March, rolling out dough at the work table while Eliza worked the stew. Not looking up, just saying it into the room. "Different how?" Eliza said. "More present." Clara glanced at her sideways. "Men around here have been noticing. He used to go through a season like he was just keeping time until the next thing. This year he's actually—" She paused, searching for it. "Here." Eliza stirred the stew. "The season's going well." Said Clara, which was not agreement, and both of them knew it. Caleb had been different. Eliza had been watching it happen from close enough that she couldn't always get the perspective on it, the way you can't see the shape of a hill when you're standing on it. But she felt it in the way the house had changed, the small domestic adjustments that had accumulated over 3 months into something that looked, from a distance, like a life. The front room where the accounts lived had started having a lamp on in the evenings more often than not, and the lamp was warm enough to reach the kitchen doorway. He'd fixed the porch step himself one Sunday morning. She'd heard the hammering and looked out to find him on his knees with the nails in his mouth and the hammer working, and he hadn't mentioned it before or after, just fixed it and moved on. He'd put something in the ceramic pot on the kitchen window sill. She'd come in one morning about 6 weeks into the cattle season and found it there, a small sprig of something green, she didn't know what, planted in fresh dark soil. She didn't ask where it came from. She watered it without mentioning it to him. It was still alive, still in the window, and it had put out 2 new small leaves in the past week. The seasonal hands began leaving at the end of March, the operation winding down the way it always did, the urgent pitch of it softening back toward the ordinary. Men who'd come for the season packed their gear and shook hands and rode out, and the table got smaller by degrees until it was back to the core of it. The 8 permanent hands, Tommy, Walter, Ryder, Pete Calder, and the others she'd been feeding since November. It felt smaller than it had before the season. Not empty, just quieter. She found to her own surprise that she didn't mind the quiet. It was Walter Boone who brought it into the open, because Walter Boone was the kind of man who waited until a thing was ready and then said it plainly, without dressing it up or hedging around it. He came to the kitchen on an evening in early April, later than usual, and sat down at the table with his coffee, and he didn't talk for a while, and then he said, "He's going to say something soon. Caleb?" She was cleaning the stovetop. "About what?" Walter gave her a look. She kept cleaning. "He's been working up to it since January," Walter said. "Maybe before. He's not a fast mover, Caleb. Never has been, but he gets there." "Walter, I've known that man for 11 years, Walter said. "I knew his wife. She was—" He stopped, chose his words. "She was a good woman, hard-working and genuine. And she's been gone 4 years, and this ranch has been running on stubbornness and habit, and then you arrived." He turned his cup in his hands. "I just wanted you to know I think it's a good thing. Whatever happens. I think it's a good thing." She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said, which was honest. "No," Walter said. "That's usually how it works." He finished his coffee and said goodnight and left. And she stood in the kitchen in the late lamplight and let herself think about it directly for the first time. The thing she'd been not quite looking at for months, keeping in her peripheral vision, moving around carefully the way you move around something that might be fragile. She thought about her husband, James, who had been a good man with a bad heart, and had died too young and left her with a daughter and a grief that had taken a long time to stop being the largest thing in the room. She thought about the years after, the camps, the moving, The particular exhaustion of being a capable woman in a world that wanted her capability and resented her personhood simultaneously. She thought about what it had cost her to knock on that door in November with a worn-out suitcase and 63 cents and a 5-year-old who trusted her completely. She thought about the ceramic pot in the window with the 2 new leaves. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She'd established that, she thought, fairly comprehensively over the past months. But this particular thing, produced in her a kind of careful, clear-eyed fear that was different from any of the other kinds she'd known. Because the other fears had been about survival, about provision, about the practical maintenance of herself and her daughter in a hard world. This fear was about wanting something, and wanting something was always the more dangerous condition, because you could lose what you wanted in ways you couldn't defend against. She put out the kitchen lamp. She went to bed. She lay awake longer than usual, listening to the plains wind against the windows, and she thought, you have already survived the worst thing. Whatever comes next is something you can manage. And then she thought, that's not actually the point, is it? The point isn't surviving it. The point is deciding whether to step toward it. She fell asleep before she'd finished deciding, which was probably the most honest outcome. It happened on a Sunday. Not dramatically. Not with any of the markers that stories use to signal the important moments. No particular weather, no symbolic coincidence. Just a Sunday afternoon in mid-April, the range drying out toward spring, the mud in the yard finally firming up, the light coming in at an angle that had some warmth in it for the first time in months. She was in the kitchen, but not cooking. A rare thing, a Sunday afternoon gap between the noon meal and supper prep, and she was sitting at the work table with the window box in front of her. She'd brought it down from the sill and was replanting it, working out the root system of the green thing Caleb had put in and adding the seeds she'd had in her suitcase since November. Herb seeds, wrapped in a piece of cloth, the kind of seeds you carry when you're hoping to eventually stop somewhere long enough to grow something. She heard him in the hallway. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, and he had the look of a man who had come with something specific to say and was now reconsidering the timing. He looked at her hands in the dirt of the window box and at the small cloth bundle of seeds on the table beside her, and something in his face settled. "I'm not interrupting," he said. "No," she said. "Come in." He came in and sat across from her at the work table, the way he sat now, less like a man making a formal visit, more like a man in his own kitchen, which was a shift she'd noticed months ago and hadn't commented on. He watched her work for a moment. "What are you planting?" he said. "Sage, thyme, some sweet basil. If it takes, it's borderline for this climate, but I want to try." She pressed soil carefully around the first seed group. "The green thing you put in is doing well. I think it's going to spread." "It came from the Ames place," he said. "Clara had extra. She said it was hardy." She nodded. He was quiet. Then, "I owe you an accounting," he said. She looked up. "Of what I said when you arrived." He had his hands flat on the table, that gesture, always that gesture when he was being straight about something. "I told you the position was household manager, and what it actually was—" He stopped. "I gave you a broken kitchen, and a hostile crew, and a storm, and a full cattle season. I gave you all of it without asking if you were willing to carry it." "You gave me a fair chance," she said. "That's what I asked for." "I gave you more than a fair chance. I gave you an unreasonable situation, and you made it workable, and I let you do that without—" He stopped again. "I want to say this right." She set down what she was holding and waited. "I started to sell this ranch," he said. "I was close. After Margaret died." The name landed in the room and stayed there, and he let it. "I kept running it because I didn't know what else to do, not because I believed in it anymore. And then you came, and you rebuilt the starter from what was left, and you fixed the lock, and you got up every morning and built the fire, and somewhere in there—" His voice did something, not breaking, but adjusting, the way a structure adjusts under weight. "Somewhere in there I started believing in it again. I don't know exactly when. I just know that it happened, and I know why." The kitchen was very quiet. "Caleb," she said, careful, "I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything right now. He looked at the window box, at the seeds going into the soil. "I needed you to know that what you've done here matters, that you matter, not the cooking, not the managing, you." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, she could hear Tommy and Nora in the yard. Nora's voice bright and specific the way it always was. Tommy's low and patient. She could hear Biscuit's bark, the short one that meant he was playing and not alarmed. She could hear the ordinary sounds of the afternoon, the ranch breathing in its normal way, the way it breathed now. Lived in, functional, not just endured. "I came here in November," she said slowly, "with 1 suitcase and 63 cents and nowhere else to go. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I wasn't brave. I was out of options." He looked at her. "But I stayed because I chose to," she said, "not because I had to. There were other options by December. There were better paying options by February. I stayed because—" She looked at the window box, at the seeds she was planting in someone else's soil that had become, somewhere along the way, something she thought of as hers. "Because this place needed someone to believe in it, and I found I was able to do that. And because my daughter is happy here, and because—" She stopped. "Because," he said. She met his eyes directly. "Because I didn't want to leave. That's the plain truth of it." The quiet between them was a different kind of quiet from any that had come before. Not the careful silence of two people managing their distance. Something that had distance closing in it, gently, at its own pace. "I'm not a fast mover either," she said. "You should know that." He almost smiled. "Not quite. I know that. And I come with a daughter and a dog that technically lives in your kitchen." "Nora's welcome," he said. "The dog is negotiable." She looked at him. "The dog stays." "The dog stays," he agreed. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a declaration. It was two people in a kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, talking plainly with each other for the first time without anything between them requiring management, and it was enough, more than enough, for where they were. The spring came the way spring comes to Texas, suddenly, violently almost, as if the land had been holding its breath all winter and couldn't any longer. The mud dried. The range went green in a span of about 2 weeks that felt almost implausible after the long gray cold. The horses got restless in a good way. The men moved differently, lighter, and the table at mealtimes had a different noise to it, more talking, more laughter, the ease that comes back into a working outfit when the worst of the season is behind them. Nora turned 6 in April. Eliza made a cake. She had not made a cake since before her husband died. Cakes were a luxury, in the material sense, but also in the sense that they required a particular emotional condition to make properly, a kind of faith in the occasion that she hadn't been able to sustain for a long time. She made this one the evening before Nora's birthday, after the kitchen was quiet and Jessie had gone home and Nora was asleep. And she made it in the lamplight by herself, the way her own mother had made her birthday cakes, with the same quiet attention that you give to things that matter. Vanilla, from the small bottle she'd been rationing for months. The last of the good flour. Eggs from the hens that had started laying again as the weather warmed. She put it in the oven and waited. Ryder Cole came into the kitchen at 8:30 to get a piece of wood he'd left near the back door, and he stopped when he saw the cake cooling on the shelf and the smell of it in the air. He stood there for a moment with the chunk of wood in his hands and the expression of a man whose face is doing something he hasn't authorized. "The girl's birthday?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said. He nodded. Then, "She's a good kid." "She is," Eliza said. He started to leave, stopped, turned back with the particular deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is going to get it over with. "I was wrong about her," he said. "At the start, saying she shouldn't be here." Eliza looked at him. "I know you were." He nodded again. That was it, Mike. No more elaboration, no softening. Just the fact of it stated, because Ryder Cole didn't do softening, but he did do truth when he got to it. He took his wood and left. She stood in the kitchen with the cake cooling on the shelf and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing completed. Not a grudge released, she hadn't been holding one exactly, but a full circle finished, the last piece of something returning to its right position. The birthday was a small celebration by anyone else's standard and an enormous one by the standard of Nora's life. Tommy brought her a ribbon he'd traded something for in Colton. Yellow, because she'd mentioned once that yellow was her favorite color, and he'd remembered, which meant more than the ribbon itself. Walter Boone gave her another button, this one copper and very old, with a pattern of leaves stamped into it. Pete Calder carved a small horse from a piece of scrap pine, and left it at her place at the breakfast table without saying anything about it. Ryder Cole left a length of good braided rope near the back step, the kind used for making small lead lines. She was almost certain it was from him. She didn't confirm it, and he didn't offer. The rope was there, and Nora claimed it immediately, and by afternoon she'd got Tommy to show her how to start a basic braid with it. Caleb gave her a small book, actual pages, bound, with illustrations of animals from places far from Texas. He presented it to her at the kitchen table with a formality that wasn't really formal, more like a man who wasn't used to giving gifts to children and was trying to do it correctly. Nora took the book and opened it to the first page and looked at the illustration. An elephant, enormous, in detail, and said, "I've never seen one of these." "Neither have I," Caleb said. "Do you think they're real?" "I'm told they are." She looked at the picture for another moment. Then she looked up at him with the clear, unself-conscious assessment she brought to everything. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "You can call me Caleb," he said. Nora considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back to the elephant. Eliza, cutting the birthday cake at the other end of the table, did not look up. But she felt the moment land, and she held it without doing anything with it, just let it exist. The cake was good, not perfect. The center was slightly denser than she'd wanted, and the icing she'd made from the remaining sugar had gone on a little thick on one side. But Nora said it was the best thing she'd ever eaten, which was hyperbole, obviously, but the kind that a mother carries with her for a long time regardless. The following weeks moved with a gentleness that Eliza hadn't experienced since before her husband got sick. Not softness, exactly. The ranch was still a working operation. The days still started before dawn, the work was still the work. But the quality of it had changed, the weight that had been present in everything, the constant calculating of margins, the vigilance of someone who knows they can be put out at any time. That had lightened, not disappeared. She wasn't naive enough to think it would ever disappear entirely. That was the permanent condition of the kind of woman she was, in the kind of world this was. But lightened. Noticeably, measurably, in the way your body notices a load being reduced even before your mind names it. She and Caleb talked more. That was the simple fact of it. They talked in the mornings over coffee, in the evenings when supper was done and the house had quieted, on the Sunday afternoons that became, without anyone declaring it, a kind of shared time. He told her about the ranch in its earlier years, the vision he'd had for it when he first put money down on the land, younger than he was now, more certain, with the particular confidence of a man who hasn't yet been tested by the things that test you. She told him more about the railroad years, the camps, the people she'd known and lost track of and occasionally thought about still. They talked about Nora. He was careful with it. He understood without being told that this was territory that required care. But he asked real questions, the kind that meant he'd been paying attention, and she answered them honestly. And over time, the shape of those conversations became something she looked forward to, which was its own kind of information. He asked her one evening in May, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, the lamps down low, Nora long asleep. He said, "What did you think of this place when you first got here?" She considered it. "I thought it looked held together with stubbornness and not enough money." He laughed. Actual, unguarded laughter. She hadn't heard it often, and it was better than she'd expected. "That's accurate," he said. "I also thought—" She paused. "I thought it could be something, underneath. I could see what it was trying to be, even in the state it was in." She looked at the kitchen, the clean work table, the stocked shelves, the window box with the herbs coming up green. "I've always been able to see that. What a thing is trying to be." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you did with people too?" "Sometimes," she said. "It gets me into trouble occasionally." "How so?" "I see what people are trying to be, and I work toward that version of them. And sometimes people aren't interested in becoming that. They'd rather stay what they are." He considered that. "And when that happens?" "I learn to tell the difference faster. Did you—" He stopped. "Did you do that with me? See what I was trying to be?" She looked at him. "I saw a man who loved something and had almost stopped believing he was allowed to," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. The kitchen lamp put warm light across his face, the weathered angles of it, the eyes that had been closed for a long time and were less closed now. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever the answer is, nothing changes. You have a place here that's yours. I want that to be clear before I ask." Ask, she said. He asked, not with the eloquence that stories sometimes assign to these moments. He asked plainly, the way Caleb Whitaker did everything, directly, without ornamentation, looking at her with his hands flat on the table. He asked if she would marry him. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about the 63 cents, the worn suitcase. The first night in this kitchen with the cold stove and the damp kindling and Nora asleep in the corner. She thought about the firewood that appeared, anonymous, after the worst of the testing. The lock she'd reinstalled herself. The storm. Pete Calder's hands in warm water. Ryder Cole's back as he walked away saying he'd make sure the wood was stacked. She thought about all the things that had been rebuilt here, piece by piece, without any of them being announced or celebrated, just done, because the work was the point and the work kept needing doing. Yes, she said. Simple as that. No performance, no tears. Well, almost no tears. There was something brief in her eyes that she blinked away before it became anything. She said yes the way she'd said everything in this kitchen, directly, having considered it, meaning it. He exhaled, a long, quiet exhale that she thought he might have been holding since somewhere in November. And his hands on the table relaxed their flatness, and he looked at her with an expression she didn't need to name, just received. They were married in June. The ceremony was in the yard on a morning that was warm without being punishing, which was about the best you could ask from a Texas June. Nora wore a dress that Eliza and Clara had made together from fabric Clara had brought from Colton. Not a fine fabric, not expensive, but well-made and exactly the right green for her eyes. And Nora had stood very still while they fitted it, which was unusual enough that Tommy had made a comment about it and been ignored by everyone. The ranch hands came. All of them. Ryder Cole stood at the back with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into something that was, for him, the equivalent of beaming. Walter Boone stood beside him and did actually beam, without apology. Tommy cried briefly and then denied it to anyone who brought it up, which everyone did. Pete Calder brought wildflowers he'd gathered from somewhere on the range. A big, slightly chaotic bunch of them, not the kind of flowers someone brings to a formal occasion, but the kind that a man brings when he's moved and the movement has outrun his sophistication about it. Clara Ames stood beside Eliza and said, before it began, "You did something very hard very quietly. That's worth noticing." "I had help," Eliza said. "You had opposition," Clara said. "And then you had help. There's a difference." The justice of the peace from Colton read the words that needed to be read, and Caleb said what he needed to say, and Eliza said what she needed to say, and Biscuit sat beside Nora's feet through the whole thing and tried to eat a wildflower and had to be redirected twice, and it was, by every measure, imperfect and real and exactly what it should have been. In the years that followed, Blackstone Ranch became something that people in that part of Texas talked about, not in the way they talked about the big operations, the Sutton spreads, and the others who moved through the territory acquiring and consolidating. They talked about it the way people talk about a place that has become itself, fully, without apology. A working ranch with a reputation for feeding people well and treating workers fairly and lasting through things that took out larger operations. Writers who had worked a season at Blackstone came back the next year, which in that world was a significant data point. The permanent crew didn't turn over. Tommy Briggs stayed until he bought his own small place, and even then he came back to help during cattle season, the way a person comes back to the place where they learned what they were capable of. Ryder Cole stayed until he was 64 years old and retired to a small house in Colton that Caleb helped him buy. And when he left, he shook Eliza's hand with the grip of a man who has revised an early opinion and lived long enough to be glad about it. Walter Boone stayed until he died, in the spring of the 11th year, in his bunk on a morning when the whole world was green and everything smelled of new things, and he went quietly, the way he'd done most things, and Eliza planted something in the yard for him that came back every year after. Nora grew up in that kitchen and on that range and in the company of those men, and she became, as Walter had said she would, something. She was 17 when she first said she wanted to study medicine, and Caleb said yes before she'd finished the sentence. And Eliza made a pot of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and thought about all the distances between that and 63 cents and a worn suitcase and felt the good heavy weight of it. But that is getting ahead. The thing that mattered, in the end, wasn't the years of proof. It wasn't the reputation or the recognition or the fact that the ranch survived and thrived while others sold or collapsed or were swallowed by men like Sutton, who eventually overextended himself and lost most of what he'd accumulated, which is what happens to men who mistake acquisition for value. The thing that mattered was smaller and earlier than any of that. It was a cold November morning before anyone was awake, and a woman stood in a dark kitchen in front of a cold stove with damp kindling and 63 cents in her suitcase and a child asleep in the next room. And she built the fire. Not because she was certain, not because she had a plan that extended past that morning, or because she knew what the place would become, or because she was brave in any of the ways the word usually means. She built it because it was cold, and the stove was there, and the alternative was giving up, and she had never been constitutionally capable of giving up. Not from stubbornness exactly, but from a deep, unromantic conviction that the work in front of you is the only answer to the question in front of you, and that beginning, simply beginning, with whatever is in your hands, is always possible. That is what she was. Not the woman they underestimated, though they did. Not the widow who proved them wrong, though she did that too. She was a woman who, when she found herself in a cold kitchen with nothing but damp kindling and the remains of something someone else had started, chose to begin. And she kept choosing it, every morning for the rest of her life. That is the whole of it.